In this frame, we enter into the third foundation of mindfulness, the mind. So we started this series of lectures by going into some depth on the body's role in establishing mindfulness. We saw how the somatic experience of being in the body can help take us out of the trance-like state where we're caught in the world of concepts, ideas, past, future, incessant thinking, doing, and into presence, into the lived reality of this moment. But as we quickly realize in our practice, there is resistance. There's resistance to abiding in this state of being. The mind is not comfortable with this rawness and aliveness of the present moment as experienced through the body. And so we encounter these escape strategies of mind, and we realize that the path of mindfulness requires real courage and care. So as part of the second foundation, we turned our attention to these deep-seated tendencies and patterns of mind. We explored these escape strategies, and we saw how, when overlooked, they lead to conditioning of mind states that keep us stuck in various ways. And so we learned how to work with these reactions and then these patterns and to free ourselves. And so as part of the third foundation, we now turn our attention to the mind itself, to gain insight and to begin to cultivate states of mind that lead to joy and compassion and ultimately liberation. So first of all, what is mindfulness of mind? And put simply, this foundation is about bringing mindfulness to our moods. The Pali term is Citta, and it's often translated as mind or consciousness, but it shouldn't be understood as purely mental phenomena or thoughts. It's the term encompasses both the heart and the mind, interestingly enough. And this term, we see that also in other languages. In Japanese, the term kokoro. So it's a type of heart-mind. It's a concept that we don't really have in the West, from what I can tell. So given the context of this discourse, I think a better translation would be mindfulness of states of mind. And so it's really about being aware of our mind states and our moods as we go through our days and our lives. And I like an analogy that Dharma teacher Larry Ward uses, which is that of a fridge. You know, we go to the fridge, we open the doors, and we take a look at what's on the shelves. Is this what we intend to feed ourselves? Is this what we want to serve to our guests or bring forth in the world? So this third foundation is really about identifying the contents of our minds and then looking into our intentions. Is this the mind state or the mood that I want to cultivate in my life? So how do we bring mindfulness to this third foundation? And coming back to the discourse on mindfulness, the contemplation begins by becoming aware when three particular mind states are present and when they're absent. And these mind states are lust, hatred, and ignorance, what are often called the three poisons or unwholesome states of mind. And so here we're beginning to see the natural progression through the foundations. In the contemplation of the Vedana, remember, we looked into how subconscious reactions to the feeling tones in the body gives rise to these type of mind states, that they strengthen and condition the mind for these three poisons, you could say. And so now we're beginning to explore the link between these hedonic tones in the body and the mind states that they give rise to. So in a sense, we could say that the second foundation is about deconditioning the mind, start pulling the plug on these reactive patterns. And the third foundation is about learning to deal with these mind states once they have arisen, due to this momentum of conditioning that we have in the mind. So these are big words: poison, unwholesome, hatred, delusion, lust or greed, but how do they show up in our lives? That's the real question. Not conceptually, but actually in our own lived experience. So for example, can we begin to recognize the degree to which our minds are driven by craving? How often are we in pursuit of some object or some experience, so we're drawn to something in that sense? So can we recognize that as a craving mind state? And perhaps we can feel it. Sometimes it's described as the grip of lust, being kind of in the grip of our cravings. And what about aversion? How does hatred show up in our lives? Perhaps this sense of annoyance or irritation, wanting to push some situation away, somehow feeling that reality should be different, or blaming somebody else for something. So can we bring mindfulness to this and recognize perhaps even these more subtle expressions as forms of hatred? Not to mention hatred in its more intense forms, where there's really aggression, ill will, rage, or violence. And sometimes this has the energetic quality of, the fire of anger. And finally, can we recognize the tendency to avoid neutral feelings as a form of ignorance? To what extent are we driven by an automatic reaction to restlessness or boredom? How often do we distract ourselves from some mundane experience? For example, the urge to escape into the digital or virtual world. And can we see this as a type of confusion that arises from a lack of mindfulness? Can we pay attention to the strength behind this impulse? What impact does this have on our lives actually? Sometimes it can be felt as being caught in a net of delusion, of kind of walking around in circles. So these mind states all operate in our system to various degrees over different times, and although it may seem obvious, like it's not such a big deal, that taken together, this actually has huge consequences in our lives. The fire of violent thoughts, or the being caught in debilitating confusion, or in the grip of some lust or craving, that these unwholesome mind states not only affect us on an individual level, but if we look around, we can see them playing out everywhere. We start recognizing hatred, for example, as the underlying mind state of all forms of oppression and violence and war and racism, and how greed perpetuates concentration of power and injustice, for example, and how ignorance really prevents any sense of clarity or sovereignty in our lives, making us prone to manipulation. So seen this way, addressing these whole unwholesome states really becomes an imperative. And the place to start is to take responsibility within ourselves. So how do we begin to get rid of these unwholesome mind states? So a common theme that runs through the practice of mindfulness is the insight that we cannot change what we're not aware of. So we begin by increasing our awareness, paying attention to the states of mind, the contents of our own minds. We open the fridge, right? And secondly, we become comfortable facing our own minds, facing moods that are uncomfortable or that may disagree with our self-image. And we do this not in order to fight them or create more aversion, but we hold them with a quality of compassion and care. And this is another theme that runs through our mindfulness practice. You may remember the two wings of the bird of mindfulness. So first, it's important to recognize that we're not bad people for having these states of mind, right? As pointed out by teacher Joseph Goldstein, who, by the way, has a fantastic interpretation and description of this discourse of mindfulness. So I've learned a lot from his work, and I can highly recommend you check it out as well. So he makes the point that we so often jump from experiencing a certain state of mind or being in a certain mood to identification. So for example, we may experience hatred in our system, and we jump to start believing that we are hateful and bad people for having these states of mind. But this really just leads to more aversion. It leads often also to a sense of guilt and shame for what we're experiencing, and it actually does nothing to address the hatred in the first place. So unwholesome in this context doesn't mean that it's immoral in some authoritarian way. It doesn't mean that there's anything bad that they are occurring. They're a natural part of our human existence. It simply means that they lead us away from happiness. They're not a wholesome meal, right? It's not what we want to be keep feeding ourselves. So the point is not to judge ourselves for experiencing these states of mind, but the practice is really to acknowledge them, to identify when they're present, and then to hold them in this loving awareness. Another thing that often gets in our way is our belief or our fear that by acknowledging a certain mind state, let's say hatred, we will automatically act it out. But in fact, it's often the opposite when we're not aware or when we actively suppress something, that these poisons tend to erupt and express themselves, even in unconscious ways. So we've used the metaphor of a lens before, a lens through which we look at the world. And this lens is colored or distorted by our moods. So if we feel rage, we see the world through this anger. We see red, as the expression goes, right? And so our thoughts tend to reinforce our worldview. And it leads to further strengthening of a belief system that the world is a certain way and our actions are motivated and so on. And this further strengthens our identification with the mood itself, right? So it's like almost like we build this superstructure of a worldview and our self-image, our ego, on top of this very shifting and changing grounds of our states of mind. So through mindfulness of Citta, we learn to take this step back and we learn to observe the lens. We can look at the anger rather than looking through and acting out the anger. And when we can hold any of these three poisons in this way, without going further and creating additional suffering or wreaking havoc, then a natural shift can begin to happen. So to summarize, when we dare to face our own minds in this way with the right tools and support, we allow for this shift to begin to happen, right? We start making discoveries and we recognize these three poisons of mind as simply arising and passing in our awareness, that they are not actually inherent to our mind, they come as visitors. It's like Rumi is talking about in the poem The Guest House. And we note that when they're not present, when there's no trace of these unwholesome mind states, their wholesome counterparts are automatically present and accessible and available to us. So in the absence of greed, there is generosity. In the absence of hate, there is compassion. In the absence of delusion, there is clarity. So this really points to the inherent and natural, innate quality of our inner being. So as we learn to appreciate the absence of lust and hatred and delusion, we automatically start cultivating more healthy states of mind. And so it's like, we're beginning to restock our fridge for a more wholesome and healthy diet, you could say. So in the next frame, we'll conclude the third foundation of mindfulness by looking into some additional states of mind and taking a look also at the importance of finding a balanced view.